Hi, in this lesson we're going to learn how to use the passive voice in English. Let's begin by defining the usage of the passive voice. First of all, we use the passive voice when we don't know who did an action or when it's not important to mention who did it. If we want to say who did the action, we can use an active voice sentence, which is the normal way of speaking, or we can also use a passive voice sentence. But if we use a passive voice sentence and we want to mention who did the action, then we use the preposition by. Let me show you what is the difference between active voice sentences and passive voice sentences. In the active voice sentences, we usually speak of a subject, the action that subject does, and the complement of this sentence. This is, in simple words, the way we normally speak. You can see below three examples. These three examples are in different tenses. We have one in past, one in present, and one in future. If you can read each of these sentences, we have one person doing the action. In example number one, we have Anna. Anna used the new scalpel. Example number two, the nurse writes a report. And example number three, Dan will help the doctor. In these three sentences, one person does an action, and these actions affect a subject, or in some cases, an object. In the passive voice sentences, something changes. In the passive voice sentences, the object is now the most important thing. In passive voice, the passive voice tells us what is done to something or someone. Here, the person who does the action is not important. What is important is the object or the agent that was affected. Let's read the same previous examples in which the persons performed the action, now in passive voice sentences. We can check example number one. The new scalpel was used by Anna. Example number two, the report is written by the nurse. And in example number three, we have the doctor will be helped by Dan. If you read carefully and if you check very carefully, you will see that what is important is not the person who did the action in the active voice, but the object that was affected. For example, in example number one, we have the new scalpel. That is now the most important. In example number two, the report is the most important. And in example number three, the doctor will be helped. The doctor is what is more important, not them. If you check, there is a difference in the way we write now the grammar, and that's what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn how to use passive voice sentences in English. There are three key elements you must identify first to have a passive voice sentence. First, in your active voice sentence, you have to identify the tense. Is it present, past, future, present perfect, or does it have any modal auxiliaries? That's the first thing you have to check. Step number two is when you use a passive voice sentence, you have to use the verb to be. In all sentences in passive voice, you need the verb to be. And the verb to be corresponds to the tense you already identified. That's why it's important to identify first the tense you are using. And in the second step, you're going to use the verb to be in the corresponding tense. It can be are, is, or was, or were, or will be, or has been, etc. And finally, the main verb in the active voice sentence has to be used in past participle. We're going to check that in a moment when we start with present simple passive voice sentences. Let's go to that point. First, present simple in passive voice. You know that when we talk about the present tense, we use it to talk about a regular activity in the present. We have an example here. People do not allow flowers in some hospitals. Who does the action? People. People could mean the authorities, doctors, nurses, managers, whatever. But in this sentence, we're using it in active voice. It's the person doing the action. What's the action that people do? They don't allow. What do they not allow? They don't allow flowers. Flowers is the object or the thing that is being affected. When we change this to the passive voice, we have something like this. The example in passive voice, now what is important is not the people, is the flowers. So we say flowers are not allowed in some hospitals. If you check carefully here, we changed some things and we added an extra thing. The extra thing we added is the verb to be. And remember the steps to create a passive voice sentence. You have to identify first the tense. In this example, people don't allow flowers. We know that it's present tense. So in the passive voice, the verb to be has to be in present tense. Flowers aren't. And then in the active voice, we use the verb allow, which is in Spanish permitir. So the past participle of allow now becomes allowed. Remember, allow is a regular verb, so the change is only by adding ed. You have to be careful because we also have irregular verbs. So for the irregular verbs, you will need to use the corresponding past participle of the regular verbs. Let's see some extra examples in passive voice. Example number 1, the incision is made by the surgeon. Example 2, the hospital is cleaned every day. Example 3, the pills are prescribed by the doctor. 4, the ambulance is driven fast. And finally, the consent forms are signed. All of these examples are passive voice sentences. I'm going to leave you 2 links so you can practice on using the passive voice. The first link is on Wordwall. It's a very simple interactive game. You can check it there and practice passive voice in present tense. And if you want to do extra exercises in which you now have to use grammar appropriately, you can go to the second link and start working on the exercises of passive voice sentences in present time. This is all for this video. I will see you in a next video in which I'm going to talk to you about another tense to use the passive voice.